My legal name is Meghan Markle, Princess of Sussex. What was staged as a seemingly quiet retreat into private life turned out, within a few hours, to be one of the toughest power struggles in the modern monarchy. In early December 2022, Buckingham Palace confirmed with unusual decisiveness that Meghan Markle had definitively lost all remaining royal titles. The decision was not the result of negotiations, but an expression of sovereign authority. In the eyes of the court, it was not a family conflict, but an institutional boundary setting. Almost simultaneously, a carefully produced video was released from Santa Barbara, generating enormous international attention. In it, Meghan Markle presented herself in a deliberately minimalist manner, devoid of any royal symbolism, and portrayed her withdrawal as a moral consequence. To the outside world, this appeared to be an act of acceptance, almost a voluntary step. But behind palace walls, this portrayal was perceived as a strategic reinterpretation. The impression that she herself had decided what had already been taken away from her was considered problematic. The reaction from London was swift. Within a few hours, a formal clarification followed from the royal office. The revocation of the titles had already been legally decided days earlier, bearing the signature of King Charles II and implemented by the relevant court offices. The sequence of events made it clear that the video from California was not a reaction to an open situation, but rather an attempt to reinterpret a final, decisive act. It was precisely this shift in interpretation that caused unease. From the monarchy's perspective, the focus was not on Meghan Markle's personal role, but on the risk that a sovereign act could be portrayed as an emotional compromise. The institution saw its authority challenged not by open protest, but by subtle narratives. Therefore, the response was as sharp as rarely seen since the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign, and a second conflict quickly began to emerge in the public consciousness. While the revocation of the titles was accepted as a fact, the debate shifted to the question of the children, Archie and Lilibet. This was precisely where the most sensitive issue lay. The embassy in Santa Barbara did not emphasize its own position, but rather stressed the children's lineage and their connection to royal history. This opened up a new field of tension that went far beyond personal sensitivities. Within the palace, this focus was seen as calculated. The separation between the personal loss of titles and the children's potential future seemed like an attempt to convert emotional support into political pressure. The monarchy felt compelled to clarify that lineage alone does not entitle one to symbols, privileges, or financial structures. Titles, according to the internal interpretation, are not mere relics, but instruments of state order. The vehemence of the reaction was also explained by the timing. King Charles II was in a phase of institutional realignment, considered crucial internally for the stability of the coming decades. Any ambiguity regarding responsibilities, rights, or narratives was perceived as a risk. The Meghan Markle case thus became a litmus test for a monarchy that had learned that emotional gray areas can be more dangerous in the long run than open rifts. What appeared to outsiders as a personal drama thus developed into a power struggle for interpretive dominance. The palace's central message was unequivocal. The revocation of titles was not a dialogue, but an act of state self-assertion. At the same time, it became clear that this step was only the beginning, because the public focus on Archie and Lilibet had touched upon an issue that intertwined legal, financial, and symbolic dimensions. Even at this early stage, it was evident that this would not be a one-off clarification. The monarchy had signaled its willingness to defend its structures, even if this would provoke public criticism. The apparent calm of the moment was deceptive. Behind the scenes, a phase began in which every word, every image, and every hint was re-evaluated. The real confrontation had only just begun. The official response from the palace marked a turning point that extended far beyond Meghan Markle herself. What followed was not an emotional rebuttal, but a precisely orchestrated demonstration of power. Within a few hours, it became clear that the monarchy was not prepared to leave any room for interpretation. The revocation of the title was complete, irreversible, and had been decided before any public spectacle. This shattered a central narrative, the notion of a voluntary withdrawal. The institutional clarity with which Buckingham Palace acted surprised even long-time observers. Instead of conciliatory words, the palace opted for legal certainty. The measure was defined as a sovereign act, detached from personal motives or media pressure. It was precisely this separation of feeling and function that set the new tone. The monarchy no longer wanted to react. It wanted to define. Within internal circles, it quickly became clear why this approach had been chosen. The experience of recent years had shown that any ambiguity could be exploited. Interviews, documentaries, and public appearances had repeatedly created gray areas where private narratives merged with institutional symbols. The palace now drew a line that was non-negotiable. Title, privileges and heraldic rights were treated as instruments of state order, not as expressions of familial closeness. The speed of the reaction was particularly striking. No sooner had the video from California been released than a formal clarification followed, leaving no room for counter-arguments. The revocation of the titles was presented as a fact, not an opinion. With this, the monarchy sent a clear message to media platforms and the public. Emotionally charged displays do not alter constitutional decisions. This firmness, however, served a deeper purpose. It was intended to prevent the impression that public sympathy could influence institutional rules. The palace saw this as a threat to long-term stability. If titles were perceived as negotiable, there was a risk of a gradual erosion of authority. This very concern shaped the wording and tone of the official statements. At the same time, a new phase was being ushered in internally. The reaction to Meghan Markle's account was not merely defensive, but the prelude to a more comprehensive realignment. The monarchy began to review existing rules and redefine responsibilities. The aim was to diffuse future conflicts from the outset. Clear rules were meant to replace emotional escalations. In the public perception, this stance appeared almost coldly uncompromising. But from the palace's perspective, it was necessary. The institution no longer saw itself as a mediator between private interests and public expectations, but as the guardian of clear principles. The message was unambiguous. Those operating outside the formal structures could not invoke their symbols. This line was further emphasized by highlighting the timeline. The assertion that the decision had already been made before the public statement was intended to reclaim any form of interpretive authority. The monarchy made it clear that it acts before it declares, not the other way around. This revealed a fundamental shift in perspective. While the public debate continued, the focus behind the scenes was already shifting to the next steps. Institutional clarity was not an endpoint, but a foundation. The question now was how far this new direction would extend and what consequences it might have for all involved. It was already becoming clear that the palace was determined to learn from past experiences and prevent a repeat. At the end of this phase, one key insight remained. The monarchy had ceased reacting to narratives and had begun setting its own terms. But was this newfound firmness capable of creating lasting peace, or would it merely shift the conflict to other areas? With the palace's institutional clarification, the focus of the public debate inexorably shifted to Archie and Lilibet. What initially appeared to be a peripheral issue quickly developed into the very heart of the dispute. While Meghan Markle's loss of her title was considered a settled matter, the question remained open as to what role her children would play within the royal order. This very uncertainty created a legal and symbolic gray area that put the monarchy under pressure. At the center of the debate was the distinction between biological descent and institutional affiliation. Archie and Lilibet are descendants of the British royal family and remain in the line of succession. But this formal classification alone confers neither automatic titles nor unrestricted access to royal privileges. Within the monarchy, there was a growing emphasis on the idea that belonging to the royal family was not only inherited but also lived. This stance marked a break with the widespread assumption that bloodline alone was sufficient. The public narrative from California had deliberately exacerbated this conflict. By emphasizing the children's connection to royal history, the impression was created that something might be withheld from them. The palace saw this as a strategic shift. The debate became emotionally charged and shifted away from Meghan Markle as an individual to two minors. This created moral pressure intended to make institutional decisions vulnerable to challenge. Legally, however, the situation was complex. Lineage to the throne differs fundamentally from questions of inheritance, security, or the use of royal symbols. Within the existing legal framework, there are clear prerequisites for access to certain endowments and representative rights. These prerequisites include close ties to the institution of loyalty and integration into the public life of the royal family. It was precisely in these areas that Archie and Lilibet lacked any formal connection. This discrepancy between public perception and internal logic led to growing anxiety. The palace recognized the danger that emotional arguments could, in the long run, serve as a substitute for legal principles. The fact that minors were at the center of the debate was particularly sensitive. Every decision could be interpreted as harsh or unjust, even if it was based on existing rules. At the same time, it became clear internally that a complete exclusion would be politically and morally untenable. Archie and Lilibet remained part of the royal family, at least in the genealogical sense. But it was precisely this dual role that made them symbols of an unresolved conflict. They represented the question of whether the monarchy must adapt its structures to personal life choices, or whether, conversely, personal paths should have institutional consequences. The discussion reached a new level when it became known that various royal assets were subject to conditions that went beyond mere lineage. Access to long-term security funds is not automatically guaranteed, but rather tied to criteria such as loyalty, residency, and institutional affiliation. These mechanisms had previously received little public attention, but now moved into the spotlight. For the monarchy, it was clear that these gray areas could not persist indefinitely. Any ambiguity carried the risk of future legal disputes or media campaigns. The case of Archie and Lilibet was therefore viewed less as a personal drama and more as a structural challenge. It forced the royal family to re-examine fundamental questions. Who belongs? Under what conditions and what rights arise from this? At the end of this period, there was less of an answer than a sharpening of the situation. The children became a reflection of a system that had to mediate between tradition and the modern public sphere. Whether this balance could be maintained remained an open question. Would the monarchy further clarify its rules, or would the emotional pressure force it into new compromises? While public attention focused on Meghan Markle and the future of Archie and Lilibet, a quiet but crucial role reversal took place within the monarchy. Princess Catherine increasingly emerged from the shadow of the mediating figure and became the central authority of institutional order. This development was neither loud nor spectacular, yet its impact reached deep into the self-image of the royal family. For years, Princess Catherine had been perceived as a symbol of balance and continuity. Her public persona was characterized by restraint, empathy, and the ability to diffuse tensions. Precisely for this reason, her new tone resonated all the more strongly. In the current crisis, the focus was no longer on familial harmony, but on defending clear boundaries. Princess Catherine now embodied the very attitude that was meant to lend stability to the monarchy, even if it was perceived as uncompromising. Internally, her influence became increasingly palpable. Decisions that previously would have been made through a web of considerations and tacit compromises acquired a new clarity. Princess Catherine stood for the conviction that ambiguity causes more long-term damage than short-term harshness. This stance also shaped the institutional response to the public spectacle emanating from California. The clear separation between personal narrative and state order became a guiding principle. Particularly noteworthy was that Princess Catherine's influence was not achieved through public statements, but through internal positioning. Her role consisted less of commenting than of structuring. She supported measures that clearly defined responsibilities and were intended to prevent future conflicts. This shifted her influence from the symbolic to the strategic level. Observers within the palace spoke of a new phase in which she no longer merely represented, but actively shaped policy. This development coincided with a time when King Charles II increasingly relied on reliable internal support. The monarchy was undergoing a process of realignment in which clear principles became more important than personal closeness. Princess Catherine became a moral compass in this context. Her stance signaled that loyalty to the institution was not synonymous with personal ruthlessness, but rather with responsibility for the future. Public perception slowly began to change. While Meghan Markle was seen as the driving force behind an emotional narrative, Princess Catherine appeared as a counterpoint, calm, consistent, and focused on order. This juxtaposition was not the result of deliberate PR, but rather arose from the dynamics of events. However, it reinforced the impression that differing conceptions of duty and role existed within the royal family. Internally, Princess Catherine was increasingly described as a guardian of integrity. Her position was clear: the monarchy must not become a mirror of individual needs. Symbols, titles, and distinctions from the monarchy should derive their value from permanence, not from media attention. This stance significantly influenced how the palace viewed future scenarios. Princess Catherine's rise to the central figure of order was thus less a personal triumph than an institutional signal. It demonstrated that the monarchy was ready to redistribute responsibilities and break with old patterns. At the same time, a new question arose. Would this clear line be perceived as a strength in the long term, or did it risk further widening the gap between tradition and the modern public sphere? While Princess Catherine rose to become a visible force for order within the monarchy, another figure increasingly faded into the background, without losing any of his significance. Prince Harry became the silent center of a conflict that seemed less public but all the more existential. His silence after the events of early December was interpreted by many as tactical. But within the palace, it was seen as a sign of profound uncertainty. He stood between two worlds that were drifting further and further apart. On one side was the institution from which he came and whose rules he understood. On the other was the life he had built for himself outside those structures. The stripping of Meghan Markle's title affected him not only as the husband but also as the son of the monarch. The decision was formal, but its impact was profoundly personal. Prince Harry was confronted with the reality that his position within the royal order was no longer a given. This inner conflict became particularly evident in the days following the official statement from the palace. While Meghan Markle acted publicly, employing an emotional narrative, Prince Harry remained absent. His reticence fueled speculation about internal tensions. Observers interpreted his silence as an expression of an inner conflict that could no longer be resolved through interviews or public appearances. Within the royal family, his behavior was viewed with concern. Prince Harry had never been fully integrated into the institutional decision-making process, but his proximity to the line of succession was losing symbolic weight. He now seemed to waver between loyalty and distance. This indecisiveness made him unpredictable, not as an individual, but as a factor within the overall structure of the monarchy. The question of his role as a father was particularly sensitive. The future of Archie and Lilibet affected him directly. While Meghan Markle publicly argued for her children's connection to royal history, Prince Harry's position remained unclear. He seemed neither to seek open conflict nor to actively support the institutional line. This ambivalence reinforced the impression of a man torn between responsibility and self-preservation. The institutional reaction to this uncertainty was cool. The palace made it clear that decisions could not be made dependent on personal conflict. Prince Harry's proximity to events did not grant him any special status. The rules applied regardless of individual involvement. This stance demonstrated that the monarchy was prepared to subordinate even familial ties to the principle of order. At the same time, external pressure mounted. The media and the public began to interpret Prince Harry as the key figure. His stance could either diffuse or exacerbate the conflict. But this very expectation intensified his isolation. Every possible move could have been interpreted as taking sides. Silence thus became the only option without immediate consequences. At the end of this period, the image that remained was of a man caught between his origins and the present. Prince Harry embodied the human dimension of an institutional conflict that could not be resolved by rules alone. But could personal turmoil have a lasting impact on a monarchy that had just redefined itself, or would it ultimately become meaningless? With the escalation of events in early December, the monarchy reached a point where sporadic reactions were no longer sufficient. A new strategic direction emerged from a series of individual decisions, understood internally as a structural reset. At the heart of this development was what was known behind closed doors as the Windsor Reset Doctrine. It did not mark an emotional end, but rather a systematic new beginning. The dynamics triggered by Meghan Markle's loss of her title and the subsequent debate surrounding Archie and Lilibet revealed a weakness, a clear lack of clarity. 4 years, transitional solutions, special arrangements, and deliberately ambiguous formulations had been tolerated. This flexibility had diffused conflicts in the short term, but in the long term, it created expectations that clashed with institutional reality. This is precisely where the reset came in. The new course aimed to redefine belonging. No longer would lineage alone determine proximity to the monarchy, but rather concrete criteria such as residence, institutional integration, and loyalty. This realignment was not a personal vendetta, but an attempt to structurally prevent future conflicts. The monarchy increasingly understood itself as a system with clear conditions for entry and retention. A central element of this realignment was the control of symbols. Titles, coats of arms, and family designations were no longer considered cultural commons, but rather protected symbols of state order. Unauthorized use in media projects or commercial contexts came under greater scrutiny. The royal family was responding to a world where images and narratives have a faster impact than formal decisions. At the same time, the future of the line of succession was rethought. Archie and Lilibet formally remained part of this order, but their position was no longer automatically linked to privileges. The reset clearly distinguished between genealogical affiliation and active institutional role. This differentiation was intended to prevent emotional arguments from serving as a substitute for structural criteria in the future. The influence of Princess Catherine and Prince Edward became particularly evident during this period. While Princess Catherine embodied the moral compass, Prince Edward increasingly assumed the role of organizational executor. Together, they represented a monarchy that no longer defined itself through conformity, but through coherence. This work was done quietly, but with lasting impact. In the public perception, the Windsor Reset initially seemed abstract, but its consequences were profound. Projects, representations, and narratives that had previously been tolerated were subjected to renewed scrutiny. The monarchy signaled its willingness to take even uncomfortable steps to protect its order. The issue was less about individuals than about principles. The conclusion of this phase was that the conflict surrounding Meghan Markle was not the trigger, but rather the catalyst. The monarchy seized the opportunity to reposition itself. But could this new direction truly create long-term stability? Or would it generate new forms of distance, further widening the gap between the crown and the public? The events surrounding Meghan Markle's eventual loss of her title evolved from a seemingly personal drama into a fundamental test for the modern monarchy. What was publicly portrayed as an emotional retreat, the palace revealed as a completed sovereign act. This clarification marked the beginning of a new phase in which institutional order took precedence over personal narratives. Archie and Lilibet quickly became the focus of the debate. Their role highlighted the significant divergence between public perception and institutional logic. The monarchy was forced to distinguish between lineage and affiliation, and to define clear criteria for privilege and symbolic proximity. This brought to light, for the first time, a gray area that had existed for decades. In parallel, a shift in power and roles took place within the royal family. Princess Catherine evolved into a moral compass, while Prince Edward spearheaded its structural implementation. Prince Harry, however, remained a torn figure, caught between his personal responsibility and institutional reality. His silence became a symbol of a conflict that could no longer be resolved solely within the family. The Windsor Reset Doctrine provided a framework for this development. It represents a monarchy redefining itself, less flexible but clearer, less emotional but more structured. Symbols, titles, and affiliations are no longer negotiated but regulated. The institution derives its legitimacy from this in an era where public narratives are becoming increasingly powerful. Whether this new course will bring long-term stability or create new tensions remains to be seen. What is certain, however, is that the monarchy has passed a point where a return to the old ambiguities no longer seems possible. The question now looms, directed at the public itself. Will this new clarity be understood as a necessary strength, or as a sign of a growing distance between the crown and modern society?